Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here coming at you with another fair-minded theology video. Today's video is on apologetic method. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. If you don't know, I was actually saved through apologetics, through arguments for the existence of God, for the Bible, and that's what led to me reading the Bible and ultimately repenting of my sins and putting my faith in Jesus. So I've been wanting to do this video for a while, and I'm so excited to dig into this topic. Let me show you the book I read. This is from the Zondervan Counterpoint series. I found them to be very helpful. So this is the book I read. It's called 5 Views on Apologetics. This thing is a whopper, 380 pages. That's before all of the graphs, tables, charts, etc. It is really good, in-depth, and I think it does a great job of exposing you to all of the major philosophical positions when it comes to apologetic method. Now, if you don't know, apologetic methodology is actually something that a lot of people argue about within Christian circles. The idea is this: what is the best way in which we should be sharing the gospel? How should we defend the faith? Well, that's all going to depend upon some of your presuppositions and some of the ideas you have about what's effective. In this sense, I found it helpful to categorize the 5 separate views on a continuum, and I made 3 continuums. So let's go ahead and look at those, and I'm just going to describe broadly which approaches fall into which categories, and then I'll go into each approach individually so you can see if it's right for you. Now, the first way you might think about apologetic method is what is most functional. You might say something like this: Tanner, I have friends or family members who I want to know Jesus. I just want to help to defend the faith when I'm interacting with them. Which approach is going to be most functional for the everyday human being here on this earth? Well, when it comes to that topic, I found the cumulative case method to be very functional. We'll get into it in detail shortly, but to put it bluntly, cumulative case is all focused on being effective and arguing what is most principally important to the individual you're talking about. On the other side of the spectrum, if you're looking for a really functional approach, you might not be interested in the Reformed epistemology method. This just tends to be really philosophical, and most people aren't philosophically trained enough to get a lot out of Reformed epistemology. Don't get me wrong, this can be a good approach in its own regard, and I'll get to it momentarily. Now, the second way that you might think about apologetic method is not what is most functional, but instead what is most philosophical. Perhaps you have had some training in logic or formal deductive reasoning, and because of that, you might be focused on an apologetic method that is really intellectually rigorous. Well, if that's the case, you can really just flip the chart. Here on the cumulative case method, we have the least philosophical approach. It doesn't have a logical structure or a framework. It's about what's effective. Whereas the Reformed epistemology approach is very philosophically rigid. And so you might like that approach if you are interested in philosophy. The third way of thinking about apologetic method is what I call methodological dogmatism. This has to do with this question: how convinced are you that this apologetic approach is the right approach? This is the one way we should do it, or it is the best way. Different approaches to apologetics tend to be more dogmatic when it comes to espousing their particular point of view. On this continuum, I found presuppositional apologetics to be the most dogmatic. That is, they were often the most rigid in saying their approach was the right or the correct approach. And again, on this continuum, we find cumulative case apologetics to be the least dogmatic. This approach essentially says, pick and choose what works for you, because ultimately we're trying to convince individual human beings. This continuum might be important for you to examine if you really care about the theory behind your apologetic method. Now that I've talked about some continuums, let's dig into each of the 5 apologetic methods, and I just want to describe them briefly so you can have a better understanding of what they're all about. The first approach that's talked about in the book is what's called the classical method of apologetics, and this is defended by William Lane Craig. However, there are other well-known apologists that are defenders of the classical approach. These include Norman Geisler, R.C. Sproul, and J.P. Moreland. What's very important to understand about the classical approach to apologetics is that it typically uses a 2-stage approach. That is, that it argues in one way up front and then switches to argue in a different way after you've established some ground rules. The first way in which the classical approach argues for God is through theistic proofs. This is proving to the individual that you're talking to that God exists. And of course, you want generally to prove that a God like the God of the Bible exists. People who are typically taking this first step will often use arguments such as the cosmological argument or the teleological argument. Their goal is to prove to the individual you're speaking to that God exists. Once you've established that God exists, the classical approach now moves on to the second stage. And this is historical proofs for the Christian God. This is trying to focus on defending Christian theism, the doctrines of the Bible. And typically this second stage is focused in particular on the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The idea behind the classical approach is simply this: if you can argue that God exists, and then you can make a good case that Jesus rose from the dead, logically putting these two together, you should be able to make a pretty good case for Christianity. Now, what are some advantages of the classical approach to apologetics? First of all, I think this approach does the best job on all of the theistic proofs. If you like theistic proofs, I think you're really going to like the classical approach to apologetics because it puts a lot of its eggs into this basket. In particular, William Lane Craig is known to defend a cosmological argument known as the Kalam cosmological argument. And many people find this argument very compelling, and so you might look to a classical approach to defend this idea. Also, I want to give a nod to William Lane Craig in the book. He had in his essay a thorough treatment of the Holy Spirit, which is often overlooked in apologetic argumentation, and I found it awesome that he actually treated this subject. Now, while classical apologetics has its advantages, I do have a question for those who are taking this approach. My question is this: I question the two-stage approach, and I would say, must the theistic proofs precede the evidences for the Christian faith? There are actually some in the book who criticize William Lane Craig on exactly this front. Sometimes it feels like to me the classical approach is focused on how people ought to believe things in a rigid, logical manner instead of how people actually believe things in real life. We are not simply deductive machines who walk through all of the arguments in an objective fashion. We're human beings, and as such, sometimes I question if the classical approach would not be better suited for a robot. The second approach to apologetics that's defended in the book is what's called the evidentialist approach. This is defended by Gary Habermas, but Josh McDowell and Richard Swinburne are also well-known evidentialists. Now, there's a difference between evidentialist apologetics and classical. I, in the past, have used these terms interchangeably. I'm not going to do that anymore. You see, the evidentialist takes a one-stage approach to the apologetic method rather than a two-stage approach. In particular, the evidentialist almost always runs to historical proofs for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Contrary to the classical approach, they don't feel that it's necessary to argue for the existence of God up front utilizing the theistic proofs. And this leads to one of the primary advantages of the evidentialist approach to apologetics. Evidentialism doesn't really get mired down or bogged down heavily with theory, philosophy, and focusing on some sort of ideal. Instead, evidentialism simply says this: the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is very compelling argument for the existence of God and for the truth of Christianity. I'm going to go straight there and argue from that point. Because of this, if you are looking for historical proofs of Christianity, you might want to read some evidentialists. They have a lot of great arguments and especially defend the resurrection. But I do have a question for my evidentialist friends at this point. Does proving the resurrection of Jesus from the dead actually gain you much ground? That is, I think that many atheists could grant the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead and still not be compelled into Christianity. They might simply say something like, yeah, strange things happen in the world, but to me, that doesn't prove the existence of God, doesn't prove the truth of the Bible, it proves that strange things happen. You see, the evidentialist method has quite a few assumptions built in, and I question how effective the method would be if some of those assumptions would be challenged by the unbeliever at the outset. The third apologetic approach that is defended in the book is the cumulative case approach. This is also sometimes called the eclectic approach to apologetics. But C.S. Lewis is also pretty well known to be in the eclectic or cumulative case approach, and Ravi Zacharias was known for taking this approach as well. Now, this approach is aptly named because what it does is it kind of takes a grab bag approach to all of the different methods, and it basically says, let's use what's most effective for our audience. If our audience is focused on issues of social justice, let's take that as our approach. If our audience is focused on issues of the resurrection, let's focus in on that. In this sense, the eclectic or the cumulative case approach might actually be considered a branch of evidentialism because it leans into all sorts of different evidences for Christianity. Now, this approach obviously has some distinct advantages. Primarily, we see the fact that it brings together many different branches and disciplines. It integrates not only the mind, but also the feelings and the emotions, and it is readily utilizing every tool that it can find available. If you find yourself to be a generalist or somebody who is interested in lots of different fields, maybe you like neuroscience as well as theology, you might find the cumulative case approach to be very effective. But I still do have a strong question for those adherents of this approach. That is this: Is your approach covering up for a lack of rigorous logic and deductive structure? Put simply, if you won't be systematic with your approach, are you actually taking away from your argumentation and failing to be compelling because you're willing to utilize whatever is available? The fourth view that is defended in the book is called the presuppositional approach to apologetics. This is defended by John Frame, but Cornelius Van Til is probably the most well-known proponent of this approach, as well as some of his successors, Greg Bahnsen and Gordon Clark. Now, the presuppositional approach is very unique. It presupposes the existence of God, in particular the Christian God of the Bible, and argues from the impossibility of the contrary. That is, the Christian God must exist because he is the proper foundation of everything else. This is sometimes called a transcendent or transcendental argument for the existence of God. If you've ever seen a presuppositionalist debate the existence of God with an atheist, they might make a comment like this: by showing up to the debate, my opponent has conceded, because if they come here to debate, they presuppose that logic and rationality exist. Only the Christian God can account for these things. Therefore, they have conceded. This has often led to some very funny and interesting debates led by the likes of Doug Wilson or Greg Bahnsen. Now, the presuppositional approach to apologetics has a very distinct advantage, and that is that it exposes major thought assumptions that human beings have, and it actually does so in a relatively accessible way. It is through presuppositional apologetics that I first learned about the myth of neutrality. That is, nobody is neutral, and we all have presuppositions that we bring with us to the table when it comes to arguing for things. The presuppositionalist approach drives for a consistent worldview that is not arbitrary, and it often actually gives the Christian an offensive foot rather than purely being on the defensive. However, I have a question for my presuppositionalist friends, and that is this: are you so sure that your approach is the biblically mandated approach and that none others are intellectually permissible or advantageous? Not all presuppositionalists are this dogmatic, but Greg Bahnsen famously pointed out every single other apologetic method as being deficient because all the other apologetic methods failed to honor Christ as Lord in their hearts because they conceded too much ground to the unbeliever. The final approach that is defended in the book is called the Reformed epistemology approach to apologetics. This is defended by Kelly Clark, and Alvin Plantinga and C. Stephen Evans are also well-known proponents of the Reformed epistemology approach. Reformed epistemology is often known as fideist, coming from the Latin word for faith. Why? Because it assumes that the existence of God is a properly basic belief. In this sense, many Reformed epistemologists would say that defending the existence of God is not necessary. No defense or justification is needed because it's properly basic. Now, if that sounds far-fetched to you, you've got to dig into some of these authors because they make a very compelling case philosophically for their position. In fact, I think that's one of the greatest advantages of the Reformed epistemology approach. It is so philosophically rigorous, and it's one of the strongest philosophical positions you can take. If I can put it this way, Alvin Plantinga is a strong philosopher. He's no slouch, and he defends this position very well. However, that strength also leads to what I think is a weakness of the position. I would ask my Reformed epistemologist friends this: for all of your academic justification for your position, how effective is your approach in actually converting real people? I have actually personally used one of Plantinga's arguments with a friend who was an unbeliever, and the argument fell completely flat. Why? Because the individual failed to understand the argument at its core level. I have found if you don't have some accessible introduction to philosophy, Reformed epistemology is just really hard for people to grasp. All right, guys, so that's my introduction to the 5 approaches. Hopefully, I've explained them well enough to you so that you can have a good understanding of which approaches you might most resonate with. Before I show you the approach I adhere to, I actually just want to say a few things I learned in this study. First, do not neglect the importance of epistemology in this discussion. How do we know what we know? The way you answer that question is really going to inform which approach you take when it comes to trying to argue for the Bible or for Christianity. Secondly, I recognize the need for pragmatism on this front. I love apologetics, but many of these arguments can get very theoretical and not be compelling to normal, everyday human beings. It may come as no surprise for many of you, but the approach I most readily resonate with is the cumulative case approach. I love the idea of having a big toolbox and trying to to select the right tool for the job. Maybe the individual I'm talking to is more philosophical and theoretical. Maybe they're more practical. Well, I've got a bunch of arguments that I can use, and I'm willing to grab any one of them if it will be effective for the communication of the gospel. In this sense, I feel like the cumulative case approach really takes on the spirit of Paul when he says, I become all things to all people so that by all means I might save some. I really resonate with the works of C.S. Lewis. I love the fact that one of his books, Miracles, is very presuppositional in nature, and yet another one of his books, Mere Christianity, is very evidentialist. However, I do have to give a couple of nods here. First, I must give a nod to Reformed epistemology. I need to dig into this approach more. I've only scratched the surface, and I have heard that Alvin Plantina's 3-volume Warrant series is very valuable in terms of trying to understand the Reformed epistemology approach. So I will definitely be digging into those works. Not only that, I've got to give my nod to presuppositional apologetics. It might look like I'm far from this position, but I have spent a great deal of my Christian life defending the presuppositionalist approach, teaching apologetics according to a presuppositional approach, and I owe so much of my understanding of philosophy, epistemology, etc. to presuppositionalism. I dug so much into the works of Greg Bahnsen. I found them very valuable. So please know I'm not writing those things off. They have just formed the foundation of a broader approach that I take these days. That's it, folks. Please recognize that at the end of the day, we're trying to reach people, real people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I hope that this review of 5 approaches to apologetics was helpful to you, helpful for orienting yourself to your own ideas. Thank you so much for all of your love and support here on the Pastor Tanner YouTube channel. Please think about liking and subscribing, and also please consider supporting us on Patreon. I do weekly vlogs there. You might find them interesting. Anyway, until next time, take care. God bless.